Bill Bratton, the only person to lead two police departments on each coast, New York and Los Angeles. Thanks for coming. Welcome.
Thank you very much. Appreciate being with you.
I want to talk about the 10-year mark since the officers were shot in Brooklyn, Detective Ramos and Lou. We'll talk about that for sure to mark that special occasion. But as we start off here, of course, I'm a weather scientist. Meteorology has been my passion for so long. As you led both departments, both in LA and New York, was weather ever a big impact in policing? I mean, obviously it's an outdoor job, but did you have any historic events like Sandy or any West Coast wildfires or anything like that that the policing was impacted?
Sure, weather is oftentimes a very significant influence of policing. Uh, we're always concerned with the long, hot summer months in terms of the street disturbances that less frequently now than when I was first coming into the business in the 1970s. But police folklore is always that with summer months come a rise in crime because more people out in the streets, hot temperatures, tempers flare. Um, Working in California, Los Angeles, that there was always the concern about fires. And right now, the past couple of weeks have been very significant fires out on the West Coast. And interestingly, this year in New York, also we had very significant fire concerns. Snow is always problematic that in those areas that get snow. I can remember working as a young police sergeant in Boston in 1978 during the blizzard of 1978, where Boston was brought to a halt by 28 inches of snow, shut the city down for a week. And I can remember escorting National Guard trucks, bringing food to senior citizen centers because nobody else could move. The Army had the big trucks, and we escorted them around. So weather is a uh, constant factor in policing.
Another sort of parallel that I see, Walmart actually did this study about when storms are coming. There are three things that people want. They come into Walmart, they buy bottled water, duct tape, and Pop Tarts. And the way it's kind of humorous, right? But the way that they found that out is they did analysis. When the storm's coming, what do people do? But in a real similarity, policing has started to use that sort of deterministic role in deciding how to police and what to do. How much of that science has translated over the last decade or so to studying those analytics and then making a decision on what to do with the policing?
Policing has been assisted greatly, and I've been playing a significant role in this in my time with the LAPD and NYPD in the development of what we call predictive policing. Like you in the weather world attempt to predict the weather based on your algorithms, based on your experience. Similarly, as algorithms became more widespread, more commonly used, policing also used them to try to predict with some degree of certainty where a crime might occur based on past experiences. I was doing that back in the 1970s. I put up big maps in my guard room at my police station, and every day I'd have a clerk put up little dots on the map. And very quickly, like you would do in weather, you see the approaching storm clouds. I would see these hot spots developing into patterns, and we would identify that we've got a burglary problem in this neighborhood. So that's where we'd assign our police officers. What Walmart and the rest of them do is when they got a hurricane coming, they go out and buy a lot more generators. They go out and buy a lot more shovels. In the wintertime, they go out and buy a lot more snow blowers to stock up in their stores because they know people are going to want those items. So no, the your world has many similarities to my world in the sense of how we go about trying to provide service to your case, your viewers, in my case, to the public.
We saw each other recently at the 10-year anniversary gala, the fundraiser for the Detective Ramos Foundation. We were able to present you with the Lifetime Achievement Award. That was a big honor for us to recognize you in that way. You were on duty. You were the guy when this happened. Will you take us back 10 years ago, 2014? We were just 5 days before Christmas, and tensions were already high in the NYPD.
Sure. And by the way, for your viewers, your audience, thank you for your multi-year participation at that event, helping to MC it each year. It's very much appreciated by the Ramos family and certainly by the police family.
My
Uh,
pleasure.
I wrote extensively about the Ramos Liu murders in my most recent book, The Profession. In fact, the first chapter begins with that murder, or those murders. My wife and I had just arrived in Boston to begin Christmas week up there with my family. I'm originally from Boston. I had not taken a security detail or drivers with me to Boston. I wanted to give my people the holiday off. And we had no sooner arrived at the hotel, and I got a call from the head of my security detail back in New York that two police officers had just been shot. They were on their way to the hospital. They weren't aware of their condition. So I immediately ran downstairs, got my car back from the valet, and began driving to Rhode Island, driving myself with red light and siren. At the Rhode Island state line, the Rhode Island State Police met me and escorted me to Green Airport outside of Providence, where the NYPD had sent a helicopter for me. By the time I had landed in New York, both officers had been taken to the hospital, where unfortunately both died from their wounds. They had been shot by a person who had been involved in a domestic violence situation in Baltimore, where he had attempted to kill his girlfriend. And now he decided he was going to come to New York, and he put out a message that he was going to come to New York and make pigs fly. He intended to kill police officers. Unfortunately, just as he was killing those two police officers, Detectives Ramos and Liu, the bulletin was coming out with his picture and description at their precinct. But by then it was too late. The crime had already occurred.
It was such a traumatic day for the police department, but also for the community as a whole. And even on a more personal level, the families of Detective Ramos and Detective Lou, just to speak a little bit about their families, the kind of men that they were. I mean, you were able to get to know them on a really personal level, and those relationships have lasted a decade now.
Reflective of the racial and ethnic makeup of New York and of the NYPD, Detective Lou was the son of Chinese immigrants. Neither of his parents spoke English at the time that he came on the police department. He was young and single. He had just recently married, and Detective Ramos was the father of several children, former school safety officer, a minister at his local church, uh, Puerto Rican. So you have this Chinese Asian officer, this Puerto Rican officer, both of them immigrants to this country, and the murderer was a black male. So you had this ethnic mix of the individuals involved. And again, the officers were assigned to a security post because of crime in a certain neighborhood when the suspect in this case walked up beside them and shot the two of them to death while they were sitting in the car eating lunch. Uh, it was a time of extraordinary tension in the city. The police union was upset with Mayor de Blasio for a variety of reasons, and they effectively accused him of having blood in his hands, and at the funeral turned their backs on the mayor. At the hospital that night when I arrived, as is always the case when officers are shot, the hospital was loaded with hundreds of police officers, and some number of them turned their back on the mayor as I walked down the hall with him to go view the two officers and meet the wives of the two officers. A blessing that came out of that tragic event is that the attending physicians asked Detective Lou's wife if she would want them to basically be able to take a semen sample from her husband, who is now deceased, so that if she was of interest in having a child, that could, with artificial insemination, that could happen. And she said yes. And today, that there's a beautiful young daughter that came out of that circumstance that unfortunately Detective Lou never saw, but she's the living legacy of him and his time on this earth. Um, the two largest police funerals in the history of the NYPD were their funerals, and extraordinary turnout for them. And it was in many respects, a time of healing for what were very tense relations between the police and the community. Because here you had these two young immigrant police officers who had been murdered in cold blood. Extraordinary times. They were two of the most difficult eulogies I've ever had to deliver because of all the emotions and the circumstances.
What strikes me too, as you look back, what's happened since over the last 10 years is you saw, in particular, both foundations have done a lot of work, but in particular, the Ramos Foundation has, had outreach beyond what would be a normal response, in my opinion, because you could have so much bitterness, you could have so much anger from this as the family, as the policing community, but instead we saw a real outpouring of effort that came from their deaths. And there in Brooklyn, in particular, a police or a local school's been named after Detective Ramos. So incredible. I'm interested, when you wrote in your book, The Profession, you talked about how policing is really not the same everywhere. It's not created equal. In the form that some communities need different things at different times. So the same policing you did when you entered in the 70s into policing is not the same as we see today, nor is it the same in different spots. And a lot of people might be surprised by that because they think that everything should be equal. But that explanation of how communities need certain things and how police need to be able to respond to that. I mean, obviously, I see it in my own family with my own children. They all have different types of parenting that I needed to give them at different times with four different children. But if you could speak to that, I think that's really important for people to understand.
One of the constant challenges for policing, where we're expected to deal with so many issues, but particularly crime and disorder, that's oftentimes mixed up with issues of race and ethnicity, poverty, wealth, is that no two neighborhoods, no two communities, no two cities are exactly alike. It's many respects the role of a police officer, of a police chief, of a police department is like that of a doctor. A doctor, when he sees different patients, he has to be mindful that he's dealing with human beings, and that's the commonality. But you might be looking at one person who's 5 feet tall, or 150 pounds, another person that's 6 feet tall, 175 pounds. So as he identifies their illnesses and trying to address those illnesses and make the patient better, he has to be very good at diagnosing what is the illness and what is the treatment, what's the right amount of medicine. And so, effectively, as the police chief in a city as diverse as New York, for example, with 276 very distinctive neighborhoods, no two are alike. And so, policing, well, there's certain commonalities that you respond to 911 calls, uh, uh, that each neighborhood, in some respects, uh, gets a different diagnosis and gets a different level of policing. Some neighborhoods, high crime neighborhoods, get a lot of policing, and that's where the tensions occur because of the high violence and the fact there are so many police and the tensions are high in that neighborhood. Other neighborhoods require very little police and require very different type of policing where there's really no crime. So officers have the opportunity to engage with the public that's not fearful, uh, more appreciative in some respects of the fact that the police are there, but the police have a lot less to do. So it's kind of like what you do in your world in terms of when you're trying to cover the tri-state area with your weather maps. Which always amazes me that here we are in New York City and 60 miles north, you have snowstorms, and out in Long Island we might have 70-degree temperatures. And
It's
so
wild.
you have to diagnose all of those different areas and then give accurate forecasts as to what's it going to be like tomorrow.
Exactly. And then everyone wants that they want to know why the weather that they want is not where they are. That's the big
Well, I have a
complaint
complaint for
department.
you today, by the way. Can you change the weather outside my window here for me?
Yeah.
That's
As I like to say, wait 5 minutes. We'll be in business by tomorrow. I really can look back and appreciate, especially reading your book, The Profession, a lot about what you brought to the New York, NYPD and also the West Coast. But when you looked at it even 25, 30 years ago, and you saw that reduction in crime in places like the subway, there was a high confidence there because you're like, okay, we got a handle on this. But certainly the last 5 to 7 years, we've seen this turnaround on both coasts with crime coming up, the unfortunate situation in the subway with the Penny case. There have been, some real, I would call them like instigators or turning points. My kids grew up riding the subway. Right now, I don't feel so good about them riding the subway because of what's happened. I feel like even though he was found not guilty, it was a shift in the culture. With that sort of prescription of looking at where we are right now, what is the turning point? Because it really is the role of a commissioner, a role of a mayor, a role of a leader to kind of start to shift things so that the confidence can come back for those that are being policed and the communities that they're living in.
That's where leadership is so important. Leadership that's optimistic, leadership that has vision, leadership that has the ability to get people to rally around that vision. And in the early 90s in New York, there were very few political leaders who thought much could be done about crime and disorder because New York for 25 years had just seen it keep going up and up and up. 1990, the worst crime year in the history of New York. Um, Giuliani ran for mayor the second time on the idea he believed he could do something about crime. I came to New York in 1990 as the chief of the transit police, the then separate subway police, 3,800 officers, because I believed that in my time in Boston, we had found a way to deal effectively with crime disorder. We had found not a cure, but we had found treatment for it. And that treatment was to address both crime and disorder at the same time. Because in the 70s and 80s, because of the so much serious crime, police really were not focused on dealing with what people saw every day, the street drug dealing, the prostitution, the graffiti, the aggressive begging on the squeegee pests, and didn't see the police doing anything about that stuff. Whereas in a city that had 500,000 serious crimes every year, with 8.5 million people, most people were not the victims of a serious crime, but we were all victimized by the disorder. So the solution, if you will, to reducing it dramatically was to go after both of them at the same time. And understanding that, like you mentioned earlier, children, you have 4 children, they're all different, but all of them you have to correct their behavior so that if that behavior is not corrected, it gets out of control. Similarly, policing is the responsibility of policing lawfully, constitutionally, policing compassionately, you're dealing with people, and effectively policing with empathy and policing within the law. And also understand you need to deal with the small things as well as the big things. So the change that came about in the 90s that lasted for 25 years up until 2019 was that people responded and people began to control their behavior. They didn't evade the fear in the subways. They weren't smoking marijuana when it was illegal out in the streets. They weren't stationed outside every tunnel and bridge entrance in the city as squeegee pests. The prostitution was gone. The 8,000 open air drug markets were gone. And we controlled the behavior. But what happened in 2018, 19, the legislature in Albany and the city council of New York messed it up. They passed a whole series of well-intended laws, but the effect of those laws undid so much of what had occurred the previous 25 years. So we are still dealing with the residue in 2024, going into 2025, with what happened 5 years ago. And this was pre-pandemic. There's a tendency to blame the pandemic for everything. The pandemic influenced it, but it was not the cause of the rise in crime in New York City. The cause of the rise in crime in New York City was our legislature, our assembly, our city council. It's that simple.
Can we turn it around? I mean, where we're headed next. I mean, I really feel like Mayor Adams, especially with the immigrant situation, the migrant situation that we've had in the city, it seems like there's a little bit of a political push to move things and realign back into that structure that was misplaced and basically torn apart.
To be very frank with you, I wouldn't hold my breath on that. The mayor, and I like the mayor, and I think his heart and his mind are in the right place. But the city council and the legislature in Albany are not there. They have no intention of changing the sanctuary city designation for New York. They have no intention of undoing the bad laws that they created in 2018. So despite the mayor's good efforts, you now have an administration in Washington that wants to get tougher starting in the next year on some of these issues. But I think, unfortunately, for New York and its residents, we're going to be an outlier. A lot of the country is returning back to normalcy is returning back to trying to ensure that our laws are uh, effective in controlling behavior, in controlling crime. But New York, it's not going to happen anytime soon. And why? Because voters keep voting these people into office who are, the term I think that's very common and popular there is the progressive woke left, meaning they are so far to the left that they're farther to the left than progressives, and they're so far to the left they're what they call woke. And they effectively what have caused so much damage and harm to the city in terms of the amount of crime we still have. Well, crime has been going down, and I compliment the NYPD, their best efforts, and Mayor Adams on their efforts. But it's like pushing a boulder up a hill with your nose. That meanwhile, at the top of the hill, they're rolling more boulders down on you, and that's our city council and our state legislature.
This is a great example that you make, because where that leads us now as New Yorkers is we think that maybe it's going to be the same as it used to be, or that it's going to be okay. But we really need to take a different angle, understanding some of those concepts that you just took or that you just put out. We need to understand those political forces that are at work that can impact how the police behave, that can impact the criminal's opportunity. So as New Yorkers, it's like the title of this podcast, which is Thin Ice. A lot of people go out onto the ice. They don't know exactly how thick it is. There's really not a lot of way to determine how that thickness of the ice is and if it'll hold you up. You think, oh, I know what to do. I can get out there. I'm wearing my winter gear, but you get out there and you quickly fall through. As New Yorkers, we get out there, we think we know. We think we've experienced certain things, but all of a sudden you're on a subway like Daniel Penny was, and something goes wrong. What do you suggest people as New Yorkers equip themselves as far as awareness and understanding so that they can stay safe and they can live this great life in the best city, but still make sure that they're prepared for what comes with living in a city?
I'm smiling thinking of your description of the thin ice. Effectively, in the 90s, the first 15, 18 years of the 21st century, we were freezing over the crime problem. The ice was getting thicker. And then in 2018, the legislature and the assembly, in their wisdom, went out on the ice and not only walked on the ice, but began jumping up and down on it. And what happened? They immediately fell through. And now they're basically freezing their butts off in the cold water that they've sunk into. Mayor Koch had a wonderful expression when he lost his last election to David Dinkins. David Dinkins was elected mayor and asked about it. And Koch said, well, the people have spoken. Now they must be punished. Well, in terms of who's to blame for the rise in crime that we experienced starting in 2018 and 19, after 25 years of straight crime decline, the voters, because who puts these politicians into office? The voters. And New York has one of the lowest voting ratios in the country. I think the
Wow.
last mayoral election, something like 13% of the voters turned out. So you have this minority of a minority voting population that effectively is been controlling where we've been going these last few years. So uh,
Hmm.
time to wake up, time to not jump on the thin ice, get back, let the ice sort of freeze over again, and then try to get out on it again once again.
Great advice. Yeah. Get educated, vote, put your voice out there if you're worried. Before we leave you, I have to ask you, in podcasting, the number one topic is true crime. Are you surprised that true crime podcasting and this concept of cold casing, or the normal person trying to insert themselves into crimes and solve mysteries, are you surprised that it's become such an armchair type of entertainment?
No, not at all, because throughout history, crime has been an accelerant of interest. Uh, Back in the days of yellow tabloids, back in the days of when newspapers ruled the roost, back in the days when radio came into being, all the radio shows, a lot of them were about crime. Television that I grew up on, the influence of my early childhood and wanting to be a police officer. What were the TV shows in the 50s? Many of them were crime stories in the 60s, 70s. And even now, when you look at the 21st century, so many TV shows, NCIS, FBI, Blue Bloods, which just went off the air after 14 years. I'm not surprised by it at all. People have always been intrigued by crime, and we're a nation, actually, we're a world of people who want to get involved. Everybody wants to, and this is where social media has ended up being such a problem. Everybody wants to get in the game, and social media allows everybody to get into the game, whatever their talents or limitations on their talents. So, no, the interest in crime, not surprised at all. I'm a product of my interest in crime. It's still am.
Oh, that's great. Well, it's a pleasure to talk to you and to
Okay.
spend a few minutes with you and to hear your voice again. The Lifetime Achievement Award from the Detective Ramos Foundation,
Kind of
so well
watching me.
deserved.
Actually,
And
might have both
all
this year.
the years of service. My best to you and your wife. It was lovely to see her the other night as well. I hope you have a wonderful but yet somewhat warm winter in the Northeast. And if
That's up
ever
to
I
you,
can,
kid. We'll
I'll get to
rely
work
on
on it.
you.
I'll get to work on it. If I can
Okay.
ever be of service, let me know. As always, great to see you and thanks so much for your time.
All the best.